Hi, everyone. Welcome to this presentation about what happens after you shift security left. I'm James Chiappetta, and I'll be presenting today. So who am I? I started off a long while ago, it feels like, as a software security pen tester and engineer. I guess now have elevated myself to be a subject matter expert in application and cloud security. I guess that's what 10,000 hours does. I've built several different security teams across different organizations throughout my career, various sizes, various size teams, various size orgs, focused on creating really a scalable program through lightweight design practices, threat modeling, automation, partnership, and security assurance mechanisms like pen testing. I have a blog, you feel free to check it out, called betterappsec.com, where I publish all my thoughts and philosophy, wisdom, what have you. Yeah, so first things first, I think most folks have heard that the term of shifting security left, and it's pretty clear, right? It lowers development costs, it reduces risks. And in practice, right, there are various outcomes beyond that. But it's typically nuanced. But today I'd like to try to generalize some of that. So today we're going to look at 5 outcomes, at least that I've seen in my experience, from shifting security left. So here are the 5 at a really, really high level. The first one is cultural influence. Second is strong engineering partnerships. The third is automated vulnerability discovery. And the fourth is continuous cybersecurity program improvement. And the last is security engineering innovation. So let's get right to it. Yeah. So first one, cultural influence. What the heck does that mean? Well, if you go back to a few slides ago about why shifting security left is important, the idea is to lower costs and reduce risk. But in order to do that, right, you kind of need to have an organization being in a position to do that holistically, right? So if you think about a security program really quickly, what's their objective, right? Find vulnerabilities, overgeneralizing here, but like finding vulnerabilities, right? And getting them patched and implementing controls to mitigate risk. So we really want to move that, and that's what this picture depicts here, over to the left, right? And what that does is get security at the top of the mind for folks in an organization. So I think the big thing here, right, is it starts to drive, starting from the top, right? You get cultural influence, you get that buy-in, and cybersecurity becomes a principle or a tenet of how the organization operates. And a key way to do that, right, is through threat modeling. I'm going to talk a lot about that, and what that really means is accounting for the unhappy path. So part 2 of cultural influence. So threat modeling, right? I do it frequently in the organization I'm at today, and I've done it throughout my entire career. And I think there's like really 2 fundamental ways to help people to start to think about that, right? And it's these 2 really common attack paths, right? Attackers coming from the outside in, and then attackers coming from the inside out, right? So if you can kind of anchor folks to those 2 things, you could really start to break down some barriers in teaching people how to think about attack paths and threat scenarios, et cetera, which sounds really daunting, but it becomes quite pragmatic and practical in practice. So taking that a step further, right? I know this is an overloaded slide. I understand that, but I really wanted to illustrate like what in a threat modeling scenario, what the inside out and the outside in practice really, looks like. So at the top, that's the outside in, and at the bottom, that's like the inside out, right? So yeah, understanding, threat modeling, right? If you're doing that, you're understanding your attack surface, you're understanding your software systems, your APIs. You're really kind of highlighting where the various pieces of your infrastructure sit and your software sit, how they communicate with one another, expected flow over them. And those are in threat modeling speak called trust boundaries, but really the thing here is you want to break down this barrier of getting people to think this way and provide structure and format so people could take away actions. Like, what are they going to go do, right? And those actions are security requirements. And I come up with a formula down here where you take your assets plus your threats and your mitigations, and that equals your requirement. So like, what are your assets? What threats in those threat scenarios you're accounting for, plus the controls you want to put in place, start to drive a vernacular around how we want to control risk in an environment. So that's that. Let me just pop back real quick. There's one quick thing I really wanted to say about this, right? It's a collaborative thing, and you really don't want to. If you're doing this right in practice, or in my mind, if you're doing it right, you're not focusing on the doom and gloom. You're really thinking about it practically and doing it together, and really saying like, well, we have to plan for accidents. Accidents happen, right? Like that's why when you get in a car, right, there's all sorts of safety mechanisms for you. All right. So transitioning over to outcome 2, strong engineering partnerships. You can't really, at least in my experience, get to that threat modeling piece. Sure, you could do it in a vacuum, but the outcomes aren't as good when you're not working with the product and the engineering teams to get the context, the business context, right? So, focusing in on the picture real quick, there are effectively 3 generalized areas of application security here that I'm illustrating. And the one on the left is the one we're in focus here. So the outcome of you get partnerships, right? So approaching people saying, hey, I want you to, have security accounted for before you build. And that happens in the first phase of the development lifecycle. And that's what the bottom half of this picture is, this overlay of like where partnerships fit in, right? You do your threat model and requirements come out. Maybe you create some tickets on people's backlogs and they go to implement, and it's like, oh, all of a sudden they're coming back to you. Hey, I need to ask a question about, this library over this library. Which one would you prefer? And you start forming a partnership, right? A dialogue, an open dialogue that continues to evolve and hopefully get better over time. So yeah, that's really, what I'd like to communicate here. You really want to make sure people walk away, right, on this partnership front, knowing that you have their back and that, yes, they own security. Everyone has a helping hand in security, but you're there to help them. So outcome 3, this is automated vulnerability discovery, right? So if we rewinded the clock back to my cultural influence slide, there's that picture about vulnerability flaw enumeration, right? And then the security controls and then cultural influence. In this case, right, this is how you scale vulnerability identification. You'll probably, and this is like an anecdote, right? Random percentage, so to speak. It really depends on your environment and your tech stack, but you'll probably get somewhere like 95-ish%, let's just say, in terms of vulnerabilities discovered through your automated mechanisms. And this picture really kind of shows you how a typical CI/CD system is put together and where you want to do some of those security checks. We don't necessarily need to dissect this per se, piece by piece, but really at a fundamental level, there are a few things that you want to look for. The first one, which I don't think I've ever worked anywhere where this hasn't been a problem, but secrets and source control. That's a one that comes up a lot, and there's a lot of great open source tools out there, like Trufflehog, that can help you in finding those. But implementing those in your CI/CD system is really great. Infrastructure as code, so like looking at your Terraform or CloudFormation for things like excessive access or policies or roles that you wouldn't expect to have created, perhaps, like really trying to come up with like guardrails and looking at those those types of guardrails in your actual CI/CD system before the change is affected in reality. And then open source vulnerabilities. So there's a terminology for this called SCA, so software composition analysis. That's really looking at a few angles of open source. So you're doing that type of check as well inside of here. You're looking at licensing. You're looking at known vulnerabilities. You're looking at potentially patterns that would be indicative of backdoors. All happening, ideally in your CI/CD system, and again, there are tools that can help you do that. Deprecated functions. So like this falls under like standard linting. You're looking for things that, hey, you shouldn't be using this function that's been a deprecated authorization function. That's something you could also implement. Or missing a function call altogether. Like maybe that like every API needs to have authentication, and you see that your code, one of your pieces of code isn't decorated with the authentication check. So you could look for that as well. I obviously like list a number of other things in this diagram. This is feel free to take a screenshot and take a closer look at this if you'd like. So just kind of going a little bit deeper on automated vulnerability discovery, because yes, anybody can not anybody, but most people can go and find tools and implement them in the CI/CD system, right? There's tons of documentation that help you do that, but where the rubber meets the road, right, is providing really actionable, timely feedback to developers as code is merged, right? Or even before that. So there's really two approaches to this. There's high signal, low noise, and low noise, high signal. If you're a security engineer and practitioner, maybe you want to go in your vulnerability assessment, right, with the low signal, high noise approach, where you can filter and go through the vulnerabilities yourself. But if you're a developer and you don't necessarily have that context or that time, you really want to be provided the most relevant findings as it relates to the technology and in the environment you operate in. So high signal, low noise is a really great way to drive accuracy, right? And have a metric, right? It isn't just, okay, I look for vulnerabilities. It's I look for high and critical vulnerabilities in the most accurate way possible, and support that with a mechanism, right, to get feedback, out of the system and from people that are using it on the regular, right? False positives occur, right? False negatives occur, things that you're missing. You need to be able to reconcile those on an ongoing basis. And if you've shifted security left, so to speak, or you are doing that, you have those things in place. You're having those outcomes. Additionally, right, the exhaust, so to speak, from the system helps you in a multitude of ways. But really, I think there are two that I want to quickly talk about that I've seen, as outcomes. And the first is, this cycle of improvement, right? Where your automation's in place, it's finding vulnerabilities, it's doing it accurately. Maybe it's cross-site scripting, maybe it's cross-site request forgeries, whatever it might be. But the better that you get at finding these vulnerabilities in an automated fashion, right, and fixing them, the harder it is to find them, right? So it then increases it improves effectively your manual processes. So your pen test, apparatus needs to also kind of look for other things and put their focus elsewhere and find vulnerabilities that maybe they wouldn't have normally found, or think about things that they wouldn't have normally thought about, which goes and finds new attack paths, new vulnerabilities that you can go automate the detection for potentially. So it's this kind of your automation improves, your manual processes improve, your automation improves, your manual processes improve. And if you're doing this accurately and you have the mechanisms to support it, then you're in a good spot. So moving right along here, outcome 4. So this is a really broad one, but continuous cybersecurity program improvement. And I footnote this with threat modeling, right? The key here is the threat modeling. So folks call this different things at different places. But doing that design review and thinking about the threat scenarios is great. But I think I discussed earlier, you have an output, which is a security requirement that you could create a ticket for, where you're saying, I need to account for XYZ threat with ABC control and, by a certain date or whatever. So you can do a number of things with that piece of information, right? You can start to categorize it in a common way and then use it as a leading indicator to tie back to lagging indicators, right? What that means is, how many requirements am I finding on an ongoing basis that I can create a standard library for? Or, how many requirements have I set that were accepted or unaccepted in a risk management process? Or how many threats are common across all my threat models, right? Like even just like threat categorization. How many controls am I recommending? If authorization is ubiquitous control, right? Again, going back to standardization, maybe that's an area where you can calculate time savings and cost savings. And lastly, like, you're creating these kind of attack maps, so to speak, right? The picture I showed earlier, where that depicted the inside out and the outside in practice in a threat model, right? Like that is a map, right? And you could hand that over to your pen testing team or your red team, and they could run with that, right? So it reduces time to get up to speed on scoping or figuring out a pen test plan, right? So it creates efficiency across a number of different avenues. I don't. The picture here kind of are the ones that I thought of, and I'm sure there are more. Right, it's non exhaustive list. Okay. So one last thing, I talked about a kind of continuous feedback loop about automated and manual vulnerability identification. Improving one another, and I think like there's a big similarity here as it relates to like threat modeling, where you get really good at, doing your threat models, right? Which helps you prevent common attack paths, which leads to, people finding other attack paths, right? Other vulnerabilities. And that allows you to discover those and understand them and account for them in your threat model, right? You want to be doing this on an ongoing basis. You don't want to be one and done. Like threats change all the time. Your code's probably changing all the time. And the vulnerabilities that are associated with your code is definitely changing over time. So keeping this relevant and up to date and on an incremental, continuous basis is really a strong outcome that I've seen from doing this for a number of years. So I think like just the last note here, right? It's kind of a repeat of what I just said, but I really want you to take this away, right? Like you're never going to account for everything. And it's kind of a journey to get everything that you can possibly enumerated. So keep working on it. One of the techniques I've seen work really well around like, you can't possibly do this for everything in an organization. So like, coming up with criticality ratings for your assets is important. So that allows you to, be able to know when to revisit something if it hasn't changed. But if you're shifting left and you're having strong partnerships, you'll be doing this on an ongoing basis, right, with your partners as they continue to develop. Okay, the last one, security, engineering, innovation. Right. I think what this really means to me, right, is removing like, or at least like keep like earmarking a piece of time in somebody's agenda, so to speak, for a sprint or a couple of weeks or whatever it might be, to think about the systems and everything that's going on holistically. Right, you have very smart engineers working on your team. They're very much in demand. Right, you want to keep them. You want to keep them engaged. You don't want to give them too much operational work operational churn. If you have too much operational work, you need to start considering alternatives, right? Do you need to build an operations team? Do you need to, get better at documentation, right? So that they can focus on the bigger picture. I quoted Sir Richard Branson here. I'll say it aloud. Complexity is your enemy. Any fool can make something complicated. It's hard to make something simple, right? And to me, that resonated. If you think about security controls in general, there's an inverse relationship between security and usability, right? Like you could have everything open, and that's very usable, or you could have everything closed and then it's not usable at all, right? So if you think about even just the network firewall for a moment, it's got a whole bunch of filtering rules, right? IP restrictions or whatever it might be, ports, protocols. And with every exception in that list is complexity you have to keep track of, right? So, thinking about your controls, thinking about your systems, someone needs to do that, and your security engineers are best suited to do it, right? And I give a few other examples here too, right? How do you detect hard to detect things, broken access control, right? How do you detect or eliminate complete vulnerability classes, right? Maybe it's possible. I'm not sure. At least you could try to at least severely reduce them in your environment and keep track of it. So these are questions that a team could potentially answer over time, but you really need to allocate the time to do that, right? So give your capable security engineers time to innovate. And giving your engineers time to innovate could really be a gift. And I think one of the interesting things, other than a lot of, I've seen just like anecdotally, a lot of great security folks go and do their own thing, build their own security product, right? Maybe they could have done that internally at a company. So I really think that this is a time, this is the place, right, for security leadership to really be thinking about how they could get the most out of their employees, and really create a safe environment to do so. Right. They have to have that time allocated, and you as a leader need to make sure that they could do it safely, give them the room to take risk, remove obstacles from their way. And I have a quote down here from Simon Sinek, who's a leadership writer. He said, when we create an environment where people feel like they belong, we create circles of safety, collaboration, trust, and innovation thrives. And I thought that was really, a really great quote to tie into this. Takeaways from this talk. What are you going to walk away from? So I hope you can walk away from this talk with at least this one thing, right? You cannot. I mean, maybe you can. I don't know. There are things outside of this universe that escape me, right? And my knowledge, but as far as I know, you can't shift any further left than the human brain, right? If you get people actively thinking about security before they go and build or develop or create something new, that's the right time to do it, right? And if you've got them doing that, I don't want to say you've completely won. You haven't completely won, but you've accomplished something that's very hard to accomplish, right? That cultural influence, being able to say, we design with security in mind, right? That secure by design principle. And if your organization can operate that in that way, you're going to have a really strong outcome, right? And threat modeling is core to that. It always has been for me in my experience, and I've seen some really great collaboration on all sorts of different scenarios. Well, I know this piece or that piece. Turning it into a game. There's a lot of great ways to make this engaging and fun, and it helps people build the muscle memory, right? So that when they are going to do something new, that security is top of mind. So, and the last thing here, right? There's been some situations in my career where it felt a little bit like us versus them, right? We're not on the same page as it relates to building infrastructure and doing that with security. It's like, I need to build my infrastructure, security needs to get out of the way, or product or software, whatever, insert your technology thing of choice here. But I'll leave this at this last bullet here. It should never be like us versus them. It should be a trusting partnership where there's push and pull, but everyone's on the same page, right? We're all working together on it. Takeaway number 2, and of 4, FYI. So use threat modeling outputs to help mature your cybersecurity program as a whole. Again, right? Like you can and you should have a standard format to document your requirements. Again, tying other processes back to them to build those KPIs. Right? We avoided a risk, right? And it could have been a realized risk because we saw attacks in from a certain of a certain vulnerability class, but because we had this control, we implemented it. We avoided catastrophe or whatever, right? You could start to do that, right, and paint that picture for the business, and you can get better at alerting and detecting things as well, right? I think like some of the best, at least. Yeah, most definitely the in terms of security relationships inside of security teams, like building a really good relationship with like my incident response and detection management teams has always been something that I've strived to do, because we're thinking about the unhappy paths and they are too, and doing that together. Like I forget who this is from, but like 1 + 1 = 3. You can really have a great outcome. So number 3, you can eliminate vulnerability classes or at least severely reduce them. I said that earlier, and it's because of that continuous cycle of threat modeling and closing down potential attack paths, and really if you have the threat modeling down, the automation down, the testing and the manual processes down, where you're doing all of that as early as possible in looking at the running environment. Like basically everything that happens in the running environment, if you've missed something, becomes essentially an incident, right? Like it isn't like, oh, I didn't know about that, right? Maybe you didn't, maybe you did, but you at least have a way to feed that back into the ecosystem as a whole. Oh wow, we missed that. Like there was some attack here, or there was some incident here that could have bit us or whatever. And now you have a way to account for that because you're already threat modeling. You already have all of the other mechanisms in place to keep track of all of this data essentially. So, really, I think that the last note here, right? It's impossible. I don't want to say impossible. Nothing's impossible, but to eliminate something completely means like you've removed it, right? So I think that, again, like going back to measurements, you can really come up with interesting measurements, right, that allow you to say on an ongoing basis, like we want to achieve 99% compliance to this, and you could track it over time. Really, this is an aspirational thing. It isn't something that you're going to do like overnight. Like you have to work at this. Well, most everything in this presentation is that way, but yeah. So the last one, your best engineers are creative and innovative. Like leverage that, right? Like I said, remove obstacles, unnecessary work streams. Be a shield. If you're a security leader, you need to protect your team and help them prioritize. Give them projects and goals that they want to work on, right? That they find interesting and want to explore. Set a time. A month where you can do this on an ongoing basis if you can't. And lastly, right, giving them too much operational work will ultimately lead to potential attrition. So you want to avoid that. You want to give them the room to find areas to simplify. Okay, that's it for me. I hope you found this useful. If you want to learn more, head over to my blog. Lots of great contributions on there from other folks other than myself. Great peer reviews. So please reach out, get engaged, and I really appreciate you taking the time. Thank you so much.